For centuries, under Shastric Hindu law, a widow's property rights were defined by survival, not ownership. When a husband died, his wife was often granted a limited estate, permission to use a home or land to maintain herself without ever actually owning the property. This meant living in a state of perpetual anxiety. A woman could spend decades maintaining a household, knowing that legally the roof over her head could be taken away by her late husband's relatives the moment she passed away, or if she violated the strict conditions of her tenure. This was the exact reality facing SMT Durgawati. When her husband passed away, he left behind a wasiyat, a formal will, that dictated exactly how she was to live the rest of her life. The document gave Durgawati possession of a residential house, but it came with severe strings attached. She was explicitly forbidden from selling, gifting, or mortgaging the property. She was merely allowed to occupy it. These restrictive clauses were often framed as a way to protect widows. In practice, they operated as a legal leash, ensuring that a woman's financial independence remained permanently chained to the men in her family. Almost immediately, that chain was pulled tight. A relative named Ram Bhawan stepped forward to challenge Durgawati's status, arguing that she was nothing more than a temporary tenant in her own home. His argument relied entirely on the restrictions written into the late husband's will. Because the wasiyat explicitly denied Durgawati the right to alienate the property, Ram Bhawan insisted the house legally belonged to the male lineage and must revert to his family upon her death. This is known as a reversionary claim. It treats the widow as a mere placeholder. Property flows to her temporarily to keep her alive, but ultimately snaps back to the husband's male heirs, bypassing her ability to pass down generational wealth. The dispute put a spotlight on a specific legal loophole. If a widow can't sell or mortgage the house she lives in, she doesn't truly possess it. While Durgawati's fight started in one local courtroom, her situation mirrored the plight of millions of widows across India. Her specific legal battle was about to stress test the entire national framework of women's property rights. To defend her home, Durgawati didn't rely on old Shastric customs. She fought back by invoking a newly minted piece of national legislation, the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. Section 14(1) states, any property possessed by a female Hindu shall be held by her as a full owner. But Ram Bhawan found an exception. Subsection 2 states, if a woman acquires property through an instrument prescribing a restricted estate, she remains a limited owner. This created a direct conflict between the two subsections. Ram Bhawan argued the wasiyat was exactly the kind of restricted instrument subsection 2 was describing, effectively stripping Durgawati of her rights under subsection 1. Lawmakers in 1956 were attempting to overwrite centuries of patriarchal custom. They intended Section 14 to act as a reset button for women's property rights. But if a husband could simply draft a cleverly worded will to trigger the 14(2) loophole, the entire reform would collapse. The protection of the 1956 Act would be rendered legally useless for almost any widow. The case wound through the lower courts, where judges often struggled to reconcile a husband's written word with the new act. By the time it reached the appellate level, the debate shifted toward a foundational concept, Guzara Bata, or maintenance. Under traditional Shastric law, while a widow may not have owned her husband's land, she possessed an absolute right to be maintained by his estate. This right to survival wasn't a gift. It existed the moment she married. Drawing on landmark precedents like the V. Tulasama ruling, the courts established a precise mechanic. If a will grants property to a widow in lieu of her right to maintenance, that property is not considered a new gift being handed down for the first time. Because the property is simply recognizing a right she already had, it bypasses the 14(2) loophole entirely. It automatically triggers Section 14(1), instantly overriding any restrictive conditions the husband tried to write into the will. The legal system took the husband's moral obligation to provide for his wife and weaponized it to break the very restrictions he placed on her. The courts made a definitive statement. Maintenance is not a charitable grace handed down by generous relatives. It is a foundational, tangible property right that cannot be contracted away by a restrictive deed. Applying this logic to SMT, Durgawati's case, the court struck down the restrictive clauses inside her late husband's wasiyat. They ruled definitively in her favor. Her limited estate was legally dissolved. Durgawati was declared the absolute owner of her home, possessing the full right to sell or mortgage it as she saw fit.
and Ram Bhawan's reversionary claims were entirely dismissed. This ruling reinforced what is known as the intent principle. The highest courts look past the restrictive wording of an inheritance document, prioritizing the true intent behind it, providing economic security for the widow. Durgawati's victory was a firewall against legal disenfranchisement. By ensuring the 1956 Act functioned as intended, this interpretation of the law secured genuine independence and agency for millions of women across India. This precedent turned a moral duty to care for a widow into a permanent legal title. It ensured that Section 14 of the 1956 Act could no longer be bypassed by a cleverly worded will.